NZXT has done something genuinely novel and exciting with this H6 Flow RGB case. As you can see, this black version has a full glass panel on the main side. At the front, we also have glass. The top panel is mesh, so that's promising. But where is the air getting in to feed the CPU and the GPU coolers? The answer is we have a diagonal air intake on the front. 3 120mm RGB fans that are feeding air in the main compartment. But if you want to help out your graphics card, you can install 2 140mm fans in the floor of the case, which will bring air directly to your GPU. This case, relatively speaking, is budget. The non-RGB version is £99.99. This RGB version, £119.99. We've got a lot to dig into, and I'm genuinely excited.
Utilizing a 90-degree rotated motherboard layout, Alt F2 carries the torch of Silverstone's stack effect, bottom to top directional airflow design legacy.
Let's pull off some panels and see how NZXT has made the H6 Flow RGB both budget and also innovative, which is a neat combination of features. So we have a single thumb screw securing the glass panel, which then pops loose and comes off. The back panel, thumb screw, also pops, mesh. Top panel, no screws, it just pushes and pops away. This panel over the intake fans, similarly pops away, loads of mesh again. The glass at the front isn't supposed to be removed, but you can remove it. It's got a number of little screws. I remove 5 tiny screws with a small screwdriver, and now the front glass panel can come away. That affects the structure of the case, and more to the point, there's no need to remove the glass. Here are the cooling fans, there's the floor of the case. You don't need to touch the front, but I imagine modders will say, yes, we like to take things apart, so thank you very much. If you end up buying the H6 Flow, it's worth noting the 5 screws for the front glass, 3 along the top, 1 on the side. That's all obvious enough. However, the 5th screw is rather less obvious and lives there. You can, if you choose, install 2 140 fans in the floor of the case. Curiously, 140s not 120s or 140s, just 140s. And the floor of the case is entirely fixed, so the fans are sitting down in this recess. I've never seen that approach taken before with a case. There's no fan rack, there's no bottom filter because the bottom of the case is the filter. In the roof of the case we can install a 280 or 360 radiator or AIO. I'm going to say the number of people installing a custom loop in this case will be very thin on the ground, and it seems to me with the nature of those front intake fans it's going to be AIO in the roof all the way. Although of course you could install an air cooler. Around the back we have the second compartment. Storage in this caddy here. Power supply goes up top. A layout we have seen before, but it still remains slightly niche territory. But this means all the gubbins is hidden around the back. All the good stuff is in the main side, and those fans are kind of out of the way. It's worth pointing out the front I/O is down the bottom of the case. As all these panels pop loose, there's no scope for NZXT to have put the front I/O up top in that more convenient location. Also, you get the 3 fans, RGB in this instance, non-RGB in the non-RGB case of, but you don't get a fan at the rear, and I think most of us like to see a fan at the rear, if only for the balance and the aesthetic. So the next move is to install some hardware. We're going to start assembling the PC around the back in the second compartment. The storage caddy, which is under that power supply shelf, is retained by a single thumb screw. We can take this 16 terabyte Seagate hard drive, slide it in, and the holes align beautifully. Then we take these two 2 terabyte Kingston SSDs, and they will be secured through the side of the caddy. Right, let's get some screws in place. Accessory pack. The screws are bagged up by type. They give the dimensions on the packaging, however they don't give the application, so SSD, hard drive or motherboard. You have to figure it out for yourself, but they have at least made things relatively neat and tidy. That's the hard drive secure, and now it's time for the SSDs. That's 20 terabytes of storage in the caddy. Slips back into place. Job done. Next up, we have the power supply, which is this NZXT C1200 Gold. Note, ATX 3.0. It is, to the best of my knowledge, the only ATX 3 power supply in NZXT's range, and they sent it to us specially for this build. As we'd expect, the power supply is fully modular. It has a 0 RPM fan function for totally silent cooling. I don't know whether it's my imagination, but this 600 watt 12 volt high power graphics cable feels rather chunky. It might be overkill, but I rather like that. And we finish up with some SATA power. There we go, ready for action. Quick check of the side panel. All this mesh does indeed go over the drives and the power supply, so we can have the power supply positioned to draw air in through that side panel and lock it down. And I note, with the power supply installed, we have very little access through this motherboard cut out any longer, which means that any hardware to do with either your air cooler or AIO, you should really install it on your motherboard on the bench. That will put the motherboard in place and then install the power supply. That isn't a problem as such, it just means you have to think about the sequence in which you build your PC. For the motherboard, I've chosen this NZXT N7Z790. The CPU is a brand new Intel Core i9-14900K. As a precaution, I'm going to install this Thermalright contact frame because I'm perfectly prepared to pummel the NZXT H6 with an ungodly amount of power, but it doesn't seem right to just overcook the processor if we can do something cheap and simple to fix a potential problem. Memory is G.Skill RGB DDR5 rated at 6800 mega transfers. First time I've used this particular kit. Previously I've used their 6000, so that should help performance just a fraction. The SSD, which is under the heatsink, which in turn is under this magnetic cosmetic cover, is a Sabrent Rocket 4.0. So I'm going to install the contact frame and then put the motherboard assembly in the case. With the cables connected, that's a good start to the build. So the next step is to install this NZXT Kraken Elite 360 RGB liquid cooler, and that's going to go in the roof of the case. What do you think? Does that not look the part? I think it does. So, the final part of the puzzle, Gigabyte RTX 4080 Gaming OC. And that goes in surprisingly easily. With the graphics card installed and a fair amount of cabling tucked away around the back, I've left these storage drives installed even though they're not hooked up, just to show it can be done. Let's see what it looks like when it's all running. To test the NZXT H6 Flow RGB PC, we ran a combination of Speedway Stress Test and Cinebench R23. That put a load of 280 watts on our Core i9 processor and 325 watts on the graphics card. At the wall socket, the PC was drawing 790 to 800 watts. This is a brutal stress test. In the first configuration we had the 3 AIO fans running at 1000 RPM and the 3 120mm case fans also at 1000 RPM, and it sounded like this. With an ambient of 17 degrees, the CPU was at 96 degrees package temperature and the graphics at 65. For the second run we ran the 3 AIO fans at 1500 RPM and the 3 case fans flat out at 1300 RPM, and that sounded like this. The CPU temperature was 91 degrees, and this allowed the CPU to run at a slightly faster 5.5 GHz where before it was 5.4 GHz. Graphics temperature also slightly cooler at 64 degrees. For the third test we added another 120mm fan at the rear. It's an NZXT F120 RGB core. With all 7 120mm fans running at 1000 RPM, the system sounded like this. To my surprise, adding that rear fan only changed temperatures by 1 degree, both for the CPU and the GPU. There's no harm in adding a rear fan, but you're doing it for the visual appeal rather than for the extra cooling. To sum up my review of the NZXT H6 Flow RGB, pros and cons. First, the good points. The panels are tool-free and easy to remove and replace. You've got loads of mesh for impressive airflow. 3 RGB fans are included. And it's good value for money, just under £100 without the RGB, just under 120 with the RGB. Cons, the negative points. You don't get a rear fan included, and I think it will cause some people some problems. Secondly, the power supply installation blocks the back of the motherboard tray. So when you're adding an AIO cooler or an air cooler, you'll probably need to do that before you put the power supply in the system. That's pretty much it. This is a case I like a great deal. I'm saying it's a must-have.